Following Jesus' lead in the parables, last week we reflected upon seeds, and this week he directs us to think about weeds. My brother-in-law is an avid gardener, so every year I see firsthand how much time and care it takes to plant and tend a garden. Another garden enthusiast is Father Tom Slan from Canisius College, who celebrates weekend masses with us. During this time of confinement, Tom has had extra hours to lavish on the gardens surrounding Loyola Hall, and the pictures he has sent of his efforts are really beautiful. Now, I, on the other hand, am not by any means a gardener. I have a black thumb, and not just on Ash Wednesday. In fact, it's so bad that even plastic flowers die in the rectory. Not knowing much about weeds, except that gardeners consider them particularly annoying, I did a little investigating. Now we know that the Holy Spirit works in surprising ways, and that happened last Sunday when the front page article in the newspaper's Home and Style section was entitled, "Is it a weed or not?" The article defined a weed as any plant growing where it's not wanted. It went on to explain that while weeds are usually thought of as a nuisance, they can be in fact quite useful. Dandelions are used by some in cooking, along with gardoons and plantains, both of which are cultivated and grow in the wild. Milkweed is a more effective insulator than goose down, and goldenrod can be used to produce tires. Who knew? And then, of course, there is just plain weed. Marijuana, being extolled for its medicinal benefits, is now legal for medical usage in 33 states. Obviously, it isn't so easy to tell what exactly is a weed. This confusion is part of the farmer's rationale in the parable we have just heard. The farmer tells his zealous workers who want to work diligently to weed the farmer's land immediately, "Let the field alone for now, and in the end we will carefully and gently separate the wheat from the weeds, lest in the efforts to separate them now you end up destroying both the weeds and the wheat." John Pilch, in his commentary on the cultural world of Jesus as presented in the Gospel of Matthew, explains that this parable is a reflection of the society of Jesus' time, which he calls agonistic, meaning hostile or conflict-oriented. The enemy who sows the weeds in the field at night is seeking to shame the farmer, probably for some long outstanding feud that has persisted perhaps for generations between their families. The entire village watches as the weeds and wheat spring up. Together they begin to laugh at the shame of the landowner. But because of the shrewd farmer's patience, at the harvest he will not only have grain for his barns, but unanticipated fuel for his needs. The farmer and his servants will have the last laugh, and the enemy who was seeking to shame the farmer is the one shamed himself. In the end, the interesting lessons learned here are not in agriculture, but rather about cultural and religious values. Do we clearly recognize the way in which God treats us? And what does that mean for how we should treat each other? Perhaps there are 3 lessons that we can take away from this parable. The first is patience. God, like the farmer, is willing to wait for us, give us time to grow, give us time to change. The wise farmer knows that it's difficult to discern wheat from weed, good from evil, in any given moment. God has even more patience with us, allowing us chance after chance to grow in goodness. But on the other hand, how often do we fail to reflect the same patience with one another? In our haste to run to judgment and punishment to secure a weed-free environment, we risk destroying others whom we presumed are weeds and therefore worthless. God is infinitely patient with us. No one of us is entirely wheat or weed, but in the garden of our hearts, there is some of both. This brings us to a second lesson outlined by the poet-farmer Wendell Berry in his Prayers and Saying of the Mad Farmer. He writes this: "Don't worry and fret about the crops. After you've done all you can do for them, let them stand in the weather on their own. The real products of any year's work are the farmer's mind and the cropland itself. Let him receive the season's increment into his mind. Let him work it into the soil. The finest growth that farmland can produce is a careful farmer. Make the human race a better head. Make the world a better piece of ground. Wendell Berry is telling the farmer and us not to worry so much about the crops, the product, as the cultivation of the land and of his or her own mind. And this brings us to a third and final lesson, that of our interconnectedness. Our interconnectedness to one another, to the entire world, and to God. How can this interconnectedness be lived out? Through gratitude, generosity, and stewardship. First, gratitude. Living with gratitude for the gifts that are ours each day, the food on our tables, the seemingly endless supply of water that quenches our thirst and washes our dishes, and a recognition that this abundance is not shared by so much of the world's population. This gratitude should lead us to generosity, recognizing how truly we are blessed beyond anything we think we may have earned or deserved. We should seek to cultivate a spirit of profound generosity, a willingness to share the riches we have that we've received with so many who are without. But beyond addressing the symptoms of hunger and poverty, generosity and gratitude must lead us to stewardship of the earth and its peoples. We are charged with challenging the sinful social structures that create such disparity and such despair. The first chapter of Genesis reminds us how in that primal, perfect garden, God gave our ancestors and us responsibility for the earth and everything and everyone on it. It says, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. Pope Francis, in his encyclical Laudato Si, calls for an ecological conversion, challenging us to recognize our place in the interlocking relationships of creation. He proposes a new environmental education that, in his words, seeks to restore the various levels of ecological equilibrium, establishing harmony within ourselves, with others, with nature and living creatures, and with God. In God's garden, this good earth, there is always time to grow and time to produce something good. Is the world Eden? Not yet. But with gratitude, attentiveness, generosity, and patience, together we can make a better place for all people.